Instead of focusing on this massive fraud or holding the administration accountable for the monumental levels of fraud and corruption in its own ranks, a Texas chairman holds a hearing on fraud in Minnesota, which is neither the biggest issue in Minnesota nor the biggest example of fraud. There's a biblical saying about the mote in another's eye and the beam in your own from the Sermon on the Mount. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own? Asked Jesus. I will leave it at that.
I want to commend my Democrat colleagues for giving an ode to Homer Simpson. When something is distracting, scream, squirrel! Because we saw a speech about global warming. We saw a speech about Orange Man bad. We saw a speech about how today's Democrat Party exists seemingly exclusively to defend violent criminal illegal aliens and to demonize law enforcement. And yet, miraculously, in that enormous word cloud, virtually nothing about $9 billion stolen from Minnesota taxpayers by Somali fraudsters, with Democrat politicians knowing full well what is happening, facilitating it, and harvesting votes and campaign dollars from the people robbing the children of Minnesota. My Democrat colleagues want you desperately not to focus on those facts. And so instead, miraculously, the Democrats have discovered the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this hearing is going to focus on $9 billion stolen from the taxpayers, and hundreds of millions of those dollars going to the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization funded by the Democrats. As much as my colleagues on that side of the aisle don't want to talk about it. With that, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Grassley.
Senator Cruz, thank you for chairing this important subcommittee hearing. And I want to point out an association with your emphasis in your remarks about the importance of whistleblowers and inspectors generals rooting out and exposing fraud. I'll speak about that a little bit, but not as strongly as you have, and I want to say that I appreciate your bringing that up. During my time in the Senate, I've exposed waste, fraud, and abuse within many government programs. At the end of last year, the American people learned of shocking and sophisticated fraud schemes in Minnesota. Billions of taxpayers' dollars may have been lost to crime. What happened in Minnesota is as bad as it gets. These fraud schemes have targeted federal programs designed to help children with autism, the elderly, and small businesses. It's deplorable that fraudsters would target programs designed to help Americans struggling to take care of their children and their families. It's also deplorable that the Walz administration allegedly retaliated against whistleblowers who tried to expose this fraud. If true, such retaliation should not go unpunished. In large-scale fraud schemes like these, whistleblowers are public's greatest asset and allies. Congress, federal agencies, and state agencies must protect whistleblowers, and the executive branch must hold criminals fully accountable to the law. That's why in January, I wrote to nearly 10 agencies, including the Department of Justice and the FBI, regarding the allegations. This is all about accountability. I want to know what the government's doing to solve these problems, hold wrongdoers accountable, and take steps to ensure this never happens again. Director Patel announced in December 2025 that the FBI deployed personnel and investigative resources to Minnesota. Attorney General Bondi has ordered additional Department of Justice prosecutors to Minnesota. And on January the 8th, the Trump administration announced the creation of a new division for national fraud enforcement within the Department of Justice. This new division will focus on rooting out fraud across the federal government, and will be led by a new Assistant Attorney General. The Treasury Department's introduced additional reporting requirement for banks and other financial institutions in Minnesota. These new requirements are designed to alert regulators to suspicious overseas transfer of cash. Regarding these financial oversight efforts, Secretary Bessent recently stated, quote, Minnesota is going to be the genesis of a national rollout. A national approach is needed now more than ever. The Department of Education has also reportedly begun creating a dedicated fraud detection team and has already prevented $1 billion in student aid fraud since January 2025. I expect the administration to provide the committee with updates regarding these efforts. However, as the title of this hearing suggests, allegations of fraud have extended beyond Minnesota to other states. Fraudsters are operating on a national scale, affecting federal programs from Medicaid to student aid and beyond. The federal government and state governments, whether Republican or Democrat, are in charge, must always respect the taxpayers and their monies. The same is true of the Inspector General community. Federal and state agencies across the country must work together to get to the bottom of these sophisticated fraud schemes. This should not be a partisan issue. Senator Cruz, thank you again for holding this hearing.
You have just watched a portion of an official Senate subcommittee hearing. The first and most important thing to understand is what this clip represents and what it does not. This was not a court proceeding, it was not a trial, and it was not a verdict. No one was found guilty in that room. Senate hearings are part of congressional oversight. Their purpose is to raise concerns, question agencies, and place allegations on the public record, not to determine final legal responsibility. That distinction matters because the language used in hearings is often forceful and political. Strong words are used to apply pressure, to signal urgency, and to frame issues for public attention. But strong language does not equal legal proof. Understanding this difference is essential if we want to evaluate what was said calmly and accurately, rather than emotionally. So the real question after watching this clip is not whether the claims sounded serious. The question is what has actually been proven so far, what remains alleged, and how the system is responding. Let's start with the facts that are currently documented. In the Minnesota fraud cases most often referenced, federal prosecutors have charged approximately $250 to $300 million in fraudulent activity. These cases are primarily connected to COVID-era nutrition and welfare programs, including schemes where funds intended for children and vulnerable populations were misused. That amount is not small. Even at the lower end, it represents a serious failure of oversight and a significant loss of taxpayer money. However, it is equally important to separate that documented figure from larger numbers mentioned during the hearing. References to billions of dollars represent concerns, suspicions, or broader estimates that have not yet been confirmed by courts or finalized audits. In responsible analysis, those figures must be treated as allegations until they are formally proven. Presenting them as settled facts before legal confirmation would be misleading. This distinction does not minimize the seriousness of the fraud. $250 million is already a major crime, but accuracy matters. In legal systems, precision is not optional. It is foundational. Another critical point often missed in public discussions is that this issue is not limited to Minnesota alone. Federal agencies have acknowledged that pandemic-era emergency programs across multiple states were vulnerable to fraud due to the speed at which funds were distributed and the reduced oversight required during the crisis. Minnesota is part of a broader national pattern, not an isolated anomaly. That context helps explain why the institutional response discussed during the hearing is significant. The FBI has deployed additional investigative resources to Minnesota. The Department of Justice has assigned more prosecutors to handle complex fraud cases. A National Fraud Enforcement Division has been established to identify and pursue similar schemes across the country. The Treasury Department has tightened monitoring of overseas financial transfers, and the Department of Education has strengthened fraud detection within student aid programs. These actions did not begin because of political rhetoric alone. They reflect a recognition within the federal government that fraud prevention requires stronger systems, better coordination, and sustained oversight. Importantly, these measures apply nationally, regardless of which party controls a particular state. Now let's address the most controversial aspect of the hearing: political blame. Some speakers suggested that state leadership or Democratic officials knowingly ignored or facilitated fraud. These are serious accusations, but at this stage, they remain accusations. There is currently no court ruling or verified finding establishing that any political party as a group deliberately enabled criminal activity. From a legal standpoint, accountability is individual and organizational, not ideological. Investigations focus on specific actors, transactions, and decisions. Broad political labels may serve rhetorical purposes, but they do not substitute for evidence. Democratic leaders have stated that fraud should be fully investigated and prosecuted wherever it occurred, while also emphasizing that accusations must be proven, not assumed. This is not a defense of wrongdoing. It is a defense of due process. In democratic systems, guilt is determined by evidence presented in court, not by speeches delivered in hearings. Whistleblowers were another central topic raised during the session. Their role is crucial in uncovering fraud, particularly in complex financial schemes that are difficult to detect through routine audits. Allegations that whistleblowers faced retaliation are serious and warrant careful investigation. If retaliation occurred, it would represent a failure of governance and a violation of protections designed to safeguard those who expose wrongdoing. Members of the committee emphasized that whistleblower protection is non-negotiable. This point is significant because it reinforces that accountability depends not just on punishment after the fact, but on creating an environment where misconduct can be reported without fear. It is also worth noting how congressional hearings fit into the larger justice process. Hearings are designed to surface issues and demand answers. Courts are designed to determine facts and assign guilt. These processes operate on different timelines. Political debates are immediate and loud. Legal investigations are slow and methodical. Confusing one for the other leads to misunderstanding. So what then was the real outcome of this hearing? The outcome was not a verdict. It was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that fraud occurred. Acknowledgement that oversight failed in some areas. Acknowledgement that federal agencies are now engaged in response and prevention efforts, and acknowledgement that further investigation is ongoing. Another misconception worth addressing is the tendency to frame this issue in cultural or ethnic terms. Official investigations do not support that framing. Fraud follows opportunity, not identity. When oversight is weak and funds are abundant, exploitation becomes more likely. Responsible governance targets behavior and systems, not communities. Viewed more broadly, this hearing highlights a recurring challenge in emergency governance. When governments act quickly to provide relief, safeguards are sometimes reduced. The lesson is not to abandon aid, but to strengthen monitoring and accountability mechanisms. That lesson applies across administrations and parties. If we reduce this moment to a single takeaway, it is this: serious allegations require serious investigation, not premature conclusions. The system is functioning, albeit imperfectly. Agencies are responding. Cases are moving through courts. Accountability will ultimately be determined by evidence, not by rhetoric. As viewers and citizens, our role is to distinguish between claims and conclusions, between process and outcome. Headlines and clips capture attention, but truth emerges through documentation, testimony, and judicial review. Fraud is a crime. Those responsible should be held accountable. But accountability must be grounded in facts, not assumptions. That balance is what preserves trust in institutions over the long term. If you found this calm, fact-based breakdown useful, please support the channel at the end of the video. Subscribing helps us continue providing clear analysis without noise, exaggeration, or partisan distortion.